By mid-morning, an eerie quiet had settled over the lobby. The usual bustling energy was conspicuously absent, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. As Brian delivered coffee to a group of businessmen near the reception desk, the sharp sound of heels clicking against the marble floor drew his attention. Judy entered the lobby, her gaze as piercing as ever. She moved with a sense of purpose, her expression hard and unreadable. Brian froze as her eyes swept the room. When her gaze lingered briefly on him, he busied himself arranging a tray of glasses, forcing his hands to remain steady. Judy approached the front desk, where Betty was assisting a guest with a check-in. The older receptionist glanced up with a polite smile, but it quickly faded as Judy's voice cut through the air. "Betty," Judy said curtly, her tone leaving no room for argument, "I need to speak with you." Betty hesitated, her hand hovering over the computer keyboard. "Can it wait, Judy? I'm in the middle of—" "Now," Judy interrupted, her voice cold and commanding. The tension was palpable as Betty apologized to the guest and followed Judy toward the staff offices. Brian's stomach churned as he watched them disappear behind the door. Whatever Judy was planning, it couldn't be good. Brian returned to the bar, his mind racing. Judy's movements were deliberate, her intentions clear. He had no doubt she was tightening the noose. With the evidence in Marvin's hands, the clock was ticking faster than ever. If they didn't act soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. Brian Henry worked diligently, though an unsettling tension gnawed at him. Judy's watchful gaze had been fixed on the staff for days. Ever since she caught him in Matteo's office, her suspicions had only grown. Now her actions seemed more deliberate, as if she was systematically tightening her grip on everyone. A short while later, Betty emerged from the staff office. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling as she returned to the front desk. Her steps were slow, heavy with defeat, and her wide, shocked eyes told Brian everything he needed to know. "Betty," Brian said softly, approaching her with caution. "What happened?" She glanced around nervously, her voice barely audible. "She fired me." Brian's heart sank like a stone. "What? Why would she do that?" Betty shook her head, her voice cracking. "She said I wasn't meeting the hotel's standards, that I wasn't keeping up with my duties. But it's not true. I've been working harder than ever." Brian clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the frustration boiling within him. This was Matteo's doing. He was tightening his control over Henry Plaza, and Judy was his enforcer, ruthlessly targeting anyone who posed even the slightest threat to their power. "I'm so sorry, Betty," Brian murmured, his voice filled with empathy. A deep pang of guilt settled in his chest. He had believed things would improve after passing the evidence to Marvin, but it was clear that Matteo wasn't relinquishing his hold so easily. Betty nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know what I'm going to do now. I've been here for years. This place was my second home." Brian swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "It's not fair. None of this is." Betty took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. "You need to be careful, Brian. Judy is watching everyone like a hawk. She's just waiting for an excuse to get rid of more people. Don't give her one." Brian nodded, his mind racing as a sense of urgency gripped him. Judy was closing in, and it was clear her purge wasn't over. He had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and he might be next. As the hours dragged on, the air at Henry Plaza grew heavier, every corner of the hotel thick with unease. Judy's presence loomed like a shadow over the staff. Her sharp, calculating eyes scanned the room constantly, as though she were hunting for even the faintest hint of rebellion. Each interaction felt fraught, every small mistake a potential nail in someone's professional coffin. Brian Henry found himself growing increasingly paranoid, his every movement accompanied by the nagging feeling of being watched. The weight of Matteo and Judy's tightening grip on the hotel was palpable, and their paranoia seemed to grow with each passing day. At one point, Brian caught sight of the two of them standing near the elevators. They were engaged in a hushed conversation, too far for him to overhear. But their body language spoke volumes. Matteo stood stiffly, his arms crossed, his face set in a scowl. Judy, on the other hand, exuded calm control, her expression unreadable but undeniably predatory. Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he was the subject of their conversation, or at least a part of it. He didn't have much time to dwell on the uneasy thought. A buzz in his pocket interrupted him. Pulling out his phone, he read the message from Grace. "Meet me in the break room. Urgent." His pulse quickened. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. He hurried to finish his task, then made his way to the break room, trying not to draw attention to himself. When he stepped inside, Grace was already there. She was pacing back and forth, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The worry etched into her face was impossible to ignore. "What's going on?" Brian asked, closing the door behind him. Grace stopped mid-step and turned to face him. Her voice was low, but filled with urgency. "I just heard from someone in housekeeping. Judy's planning to fire more people. She's targeting anyone she thinks might be a threat." Brian felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. "How many are we talking about?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Grace shook her head, frustration and fear evident in her expression. "I don't know exactly, but I overheard her talking to Matteo earlier. They're doubling down, Brian. They're not stopping until they've gotten rid of anyone who isn't fully under their control." Brian ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. This was worse than he had anticipated. He had hoped Marvin would act quickly with the evidence that Rodriguez's reign over Henry Plaza would start to crumble, but instead Matteo seemed to be digging in, solidifying his power while he still could. "We need to stay calm," Brian said, though the tension in his voice betrayed his own growing anxiety. "Marvin has the evidence. It's just a matter of time before he takes action." Grace nodded, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. What if it's not enough? What if Matteo figures out what we're doing before the board steps in? He's watching everyone, Brian. Judy's sniffing around like she knows something. Brian didn't have a reassuring answer for that. They were walking on a knife's edge, and any misstep could ruin everything. "We'll have to be even more careful," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We can't draw attention to ourselves. Keep your head down. Stick to the routine. We're too close to let this fall apart now." Grace nodded again, but her shoulders remained tense, her gaze clouded with worry. "We're running out of time," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Brian didn't respond. He knew she was right. The clock was ticking, and every second brought them closer to either exposing Matteo's corruption or falling victim to it. The rest of the day at Henry Plaza was a whirlwind of tense whispers and furtive glances. Brian Henry did his best to remain inconspicuous, but it was obvious that Judy's suspicions were intensifying. Every time she walked by, her sharp gaze seemed to linger on him, as if she were waiting for a misstep that would confirm her doubts. By the time his shift ended, Brian was utterly drained, his nerves frayed and his body heavy with exhaustion. The burden of the secret he carried weighed him down more each day, and the relentless tension was beginning to take its toll. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, Brian turned to look up at the imposing façade of the Henry Plaza Hotel, once a shining beacon of excellence and hospitality, a place where his father had built a legacy of warmth and success. It now stood as a hollow shell of its former glory. The gleaming exterior hid the fear and corruption festering inside. Staff lived in constant dread of losing their jobs, while guests remained blissfully unaware of the toxic environment beneath the surface. Clenching his fists, Brian felt a surge of determination rise within him. He couldn't let Matteo dismantle everything his father had worked so hard to create. He had come too far to back down now. He was resolved to see this through to the bitter end, no matter what it cost him. The next morning, Brian arrived at the hotel earlier than usual, determined to maintain a low profile and stay out of Judy's line of sight. But as soon as he stepped into the lobby, An ominous stillness hit him like a wave. The typical hustle and bustle had been replaced by an unnatural silence. Staff moved quickly but quietly, their heads down and their expressions grim. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Something had shifted overnight. Brian made his way to the bar, where Scott was wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. The usual energy Scott brought to his work was noticeably absent. When Scott looked up and saw Brian, he gave him a faint nod, his expression grim. "Something's going on," Scott muttered under his breath, barely audible over the low hum of the lobby. "Everyone's on edge." Before Brian could ask what he meant, Mateo strode into the lobby, his imposing figure cutting through the room like a storm front. Judy followed closely behind, her gaze scanning the room like a predator. The pair moved with a chilling sense of purpose, their faces hard with determination. Brian's heart pounded as he watched them walk past, heading straight for the staff office. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. Brian's unease only deepened as he moved through the staff corridors. The tension among the employees was palpable. Whispers floated in hushed tones, punctuated by furtive glances and hurried steps. The fear etched on their faces was unmistakable. Brian's chest tightened as he passed a small group of housekeepers speaking in low voices. Their expressions mirrored the sense of dread that hung over the entire hotel. The oppressive atmosphere made one thing clear. Mateo's grip on Henry Plaza was growing tighter by the hour. Linda's sudden firing had sent a ripple of fear through the staff, and now it seemed Judy and Mateo were escalating their campaign. Brian couldn't shake the feeling that anyone who stepped even slightly out of line would be the next target. But the suffocating fear only hardened his resolve. He couldn't let this continue. Mateo and Judy's reign of terror had gone on long enough. Marvin had the evidence. Now, it was only a matter of time before the board stepped in to confront Mateo. Yet time was slipping through Brian's fingers like sand. Each passing day without action felt like a lifetime. The longer the board delayed, the greater the risk that Mateo or Judy would uncover Brian and Grace's efforts. If that happened, it wouldn't just be the hotel that suffered. The consequences for Brian and Grace would be catastrophic. Brian forced himself to focus as he continued his work. He couldn't afford to falter now. Too much was at stake, and the clock was ticking. As Brian entered the staff break room, he found Grace already waiting for him. She sat at one of the small, worn tables, her fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against its surface. When her eyes met his, they were filled with the same unease that had been gnawing at him for days. "Any updates?" Grace asked softly as Brian slid into the chair across from her. Brian shook his head, frustration etched into his face. "Nothing yet. I keep waiting for Marvin to make his move, but it's like time is standing still. Meanwhile, Mateo is becoming more ruthless by the hour." Grace exhaled sharply, her shoulders tensing. "Judy fired 3 more housekeepers this morning. She's systematically getting rid of anyone she thinks could turn against Mateo." A knot of anger and worry tightened in Brian's chest. This was exactly the nightmare he had anticipated. Mateo and Judy were fortifying their control, ensuring that no dissenters remained to challenge their authority. "We're running out of time," Brian said, his voice taut. "If the board doesn't step in soon, Mateo is going to wipe out what's left of the staff. And if he gets wind of the evidence—" "He won't," Grace said quickly, her tone firm even as doubt flickered in her eyes. "Marvin will come through. He has to." Brian wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that Marvin, with his position on the board and his history with Brian's father, would act swiftly to dismantle Mateo's regime, but as each day passed without action, that faith was beginning to waver. "We need to be cautious," Brian said quietly, leaning closer. "Mateo's paranoia is ramping up. He's going to start watching everyone even more closely. If we make one wrong move—" "I know," Grace whispered, cutting him off. Her voice trembled, her eyes darting toward the door. "You can feel it in the air. He's just waiting for someone to slip." Brian nodded, his mind racing with the weight of their situation. The walls were closing in, and the stakes had never been higher. Every decision from here on out had to be calculated, every step executed with precision. They couldn't afford any more delays. But the question lingered in his mind. How much longer could they hold out? Brian Henry stood behind the bar at Henry Plaza, mechanically pouring drinks for a group of businessmen who were deep in conversation. Though his hands moved with practiced ease, his thoughts were miles away, looping through the tense events of the past week. Every passing moment felt heavier, each decision more urgent than the last. As he wiped the countertop, Brian's gaze drifted across the lobby. There, moving with his usual air of smug authority, was Mateo. The sight of him ignited a familiar anger in Brian's chest. Mateo strode through the hotel as if he owned not just the building but everyone in it. That smug confidence only deepened Brian's resolve, though it sickened him to think of the countless lives Mateo had disrupted in his ruthless quest for control. Brian's grip on the glass in his hand tightened as Mateo stopped at the front desk, exchanging a few quiet words with Judy. After a brief exchange, the two disappeared into the staff office. Watching them go, Brian felt his jaw clench. He didn't know what they were planning, but he knew it wouldn't be good. Mateo wasn't the type to sit idle, especially not after recent escalations. Before Brian could delve further into his thoughts, a light tap on his shoulder startled him. Turning, he saw Scott, the bartender, his face unusually pale. Fear shone in Scott's eyes, a look that immediately set Brian on edge. "Brian," Scott whispered, his voice barely audible. He glanced around nervously, ensuring no one was watching. "We need to talk, now." Brian felt his pulse quicken as he followed Scott into the staff break room. Once inside, Scott shut the door firmly and turned to face him, his expression grim. "What's going on?" Brian asked, his voice low but firm. Scott ran a shaky hand through his hair, his unease palpable. "I overheard something earlier," he began, his tone urgent. "Mateo and Judy, they're planning to fire more people. But this time it's not just the housekeeping staff or the front desk. They're targeting anyone they think might be working against them." Brian's stomach churned. "How do you know?" Scott swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room as though afraid someone might be listening. "I heard them talking by the service elevators. Mateo's convinced someone's working against him. Judy's been keeping a close eye on everyone, trying to figure out who it is. And," Scott hesitated, his voice faltering, "they mentioned you, Brian." The words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He felt his blood run cold. "What exactly did they say?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Judy's been suspicious of you ever since she caught you near Mateo's office," Scott explained, his hands trembling. "Mateo thinks there's a mole in the staff, someone snooping around. They didn't outright accuse you, but your name came up. They're watching you, Brian." Brian's heart raced as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Judy's suspicions were more than a minor inconvenience. They were a direct threat. If Mateo realized what Brian and Grace had been doing, everything would unravel. "What else did you hear?" Brian pressed. Scott shook his head, his fear evident. "Not much, just that they're planning to act soon. Brian, you need to be careful. If Mateo figures out what you're up to..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Brian nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The danger was closing in, and every second mattered. If he didn't get the evidence to Marvin and the board soon, Mateo would solidify his grip on Henry Plaza, and any hope of saving the hotel and its staff would be lost. "Thanks for telling me," Brian said, placing a steadying hand on Scott's shoulder. "But I'll handle this." Scott nodded, though his expression remained grim. "Just watch your back, Brian." As Scott left the room, Brian leaned against the table, his thoughts a storm of urgency and determination. The noose was tightening, and the stakes had never been higher. He had to act now, before it was too late. That evening, after his shift ended, Brian Henry found Grace waiting for him in the break room. Her concerned expression deepened as soon as she saw him walk in. "What's wrong?" Grace asked, her voice soft but urgent. Brian quickly recounted everything Scott had told him, his words low and tense. Grace listened intently, her expression growing darker with every detail. "I may know," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Judy's had her eye on you ever since you were caught near Mateo's office. If they're planning more firings, you'll be at the top of their list." Brian nodded grimly. "I've thought about that, but we can't wait anymore. We have to get this evidence to Marvin and the rest of the board before Mateo strikes again." Grace frowned, clearly weighing the risks. "But how do we do that? It's not like we can just walk into a board meeting. If Mateo gets even the slightest hint—" "He won't," Brian interrupted firmly. "I'll make sure of it. We'll be careful, but we don't have a choice anymore. If we don't act now, it'll all be over." Grace hesitated, biting her lip. Her worry was plain, but she nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Brian tried to offer a reassuring smile, though the knot of anxiety in his chest felt tighter than ever. "I will." The next morning, Brian arrived at Henry Plaza earlier than usual. His mind was set, his plan fully formed. All night he had gone over the details, preparing for every possible outcome. The evidence had to reach Marvin, but going through official channels wasn't an option. He needed to outmaneuver Mateo and Judy entirely. As he entered the lobby, the suffocating tension in the air hit him immediately. Staff moved quickly, heads down, avoiding unnecessary conversation or eye contact. Fear hung heavy on their faces. Judy had ramped up her surveillance, her presence a constant reminder that no one was safe. Everyone knew another round of firings could come at any moment. Brian's heart raced as he approached the elevators. His plan was simple: bypass Mateo and Judy and get the evidence to Marvin directly. It was risky, but it was the only shot they had. Just as he stepped toward the opening elevator doors, he felt a firm hand grip his shoulder. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with Judy. Her expression was icy, her tone clipped. "Mr. Matthews?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "A word if you don't mind?" Brian's pulse quickened, but he maintained a calm facade as he followed Judy into the staff office. The room felt stifling, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Judy motioned for him to sit, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. "I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time moving around the hotel," she began, her tone as cold as her expression. "More than usual, wouldn't you say?" Brian forced a casual smile, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Just trying to stay busy and do my job." Judy didn't return the smile. Instead, she leaned forward, her tone hardening. "That's good to hear. Mr. Mateo expects complete diligence from his staff, especially in times like these." Brian nodded, keeping his breathing steady despite the tension knotting his stomach. "I trust," Judy continued, her voice laced with suspicion, "that you're not involved in anything you shouldn't be. Mr. Mateo has little patience for disloyalty." Brian met her gaze evenly, masking the storm of anxiety swirling inside. "I'm just here to do my job, Judy, nothing more." Judy's eyes narrowed, studying him with unsettling intensity. The silence stretched between them, fraught with unspoken threats. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "Good, let's keep it that way." Brian stood, offering a polite nod before leaving the office. His heart pounded as he walked down the hallway, but he forced himself to maintain a calm demeanor. Judy's warning was clear. She was watching him closely. Any mistake now would cost him everything. Despite the confrontation, Brian's resolve only solidified. Time was running out, but he couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had to get the evidence into Marvin's hands before Mateo and Judy tightened their grip any further. This was the moment to act, and Brian wouldn't let it slip away. The following days at Henry Plaza Hotel were a blur of unease and watchful eyes. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to weigh down on the staff, each of them moving with caution, as though one wrong step could cost them everything. Judy's suspicions of Brian Henry hadn't eased, and her cold, calculating gaze followed him everywhere. Every action felt scrutinized, every gesture judged. Brian knew time was running out. Matteo's paranoia was escalating, and it was only a matter of time before he struck again. Scott's warning rang in Brian's mind repeatedly. Matteo was convinced someone was working against him, and Brian knew his days undercover were numbered. He had no choice but to act. Late one afternoon, the hotel felt unusually subdued. Brian stood behind the bar, methodically wiping down glasses, though his thoughts were far from his mundane task. For days, he had been crafting a plan, preparing for this precise moment. He couldn't wait for Marvin to take action. Rodriguez and Judy's grip on the hotel was tightening, and any official route would be intercepted. As Brian glanced around, ensuring the lobby was free of prying eyes, he steadied his resolve. The time had come. With the bar cleaned and the lobby relatively quiet, he slipped into the employee corridors, his steps swift and deliberate. He reached the service elevators, pressing the button for the top floor. The layout of the hotel was etched into his memory, a knowledge born of countless hours navigating its every corner. That knowledge was now his greatest advantage. The elevator dinged softly as it reached its destination. The top floor, reserved for the board's private offices, was a hushed, restricted space. Brian stepped out cautiously, the corridor dimly lit and eerily silent. He moved quickly, his heart pounding as he passed closed doors. At the far end of the hall stood his goal, Marvin's office. Brian hesitated outside the door, his pulse racing. Knocking wasn't an option. Drawing attention now would ruin everything. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket and sent Marvin a short, urgent message. "I need to see you. It's about Matteo. Meet me outside the hotel." The seconds stretched endlessly as Brian waited for a response. The silence of the corridor only heightened his tension. Finally, his phone buzzed and he exhaled in relief as he read Marvin's reply. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Brian pocketed his phone and scanned the hallway. He needed to leave, and he needed to do it without anyone noticing. Retracing his steps, he moved quickly but cautiously, the quiet of the floor amplifying every sound. Back in the service elevator, Brian allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. The evidence was in Marvin's hands now, or it would be soon. The wheels were finally in motion, but the danger wasn't over. Brian knew Matteo wouldn't go down without a fight. As the elevator descended, his resolve hardened. He had risked everything to protect the legacy of Henry Plaza, and he wouldn't stop until justice. Brian Henry made his way down to the lobby, his heart pounding as he neared the front doors of Henry Plaza Hotel. The tension in the air was palpable, and his every step felt weighted with the risk he was taking. As he approached the exit, his breath caught when he spotted Judy standing near the reception desk, engaged in a conversation with a guest. Her sharp gaze briefly flicked in his direction, and Brian's pulse quickened. For a split second, he was certain she would call out to him. Instead, her focus shifted back to the guest, her demeanor calm but calculating. Brian exhaled quietly, relieved but still on edge, and slipped out of the building without drawing further attention. The cool evening air greeted him as he stepped onto the bustling sidewalk. He moved quickly to the side of the hotel, finding a shadowed corner where he could wait out of sight. His eyes darted back toward the main entrance, scanning for any sign of Matteo or Judy. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Every noise, the faint hum of passing cars, the distant murmur of pedestrians, seemed unnaturally loud. Brian's nerves were stretched thin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He stole frequent glances toward the hotel, half expecting Matteo or Judy to appear at any moment. Finally, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, the tinted window lowered, revealing Marvin behind the wheel. His expression was as serious as Brian had ever seen it. Without hesitation, Brian crossed the short distance, opened the passenger door, and slipped into the car. "Thanks for coming," Brian said, his voice low, tinged with urgency. Marvin's eyes narrowed as he turned to face Brian. "What's going on? Your message said this was about Mateo." Brian nodded, pulling out his phone. He unlocked it and handed it to Marvin, the screen displaying the incriminating files. "I've got proof," Brian began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Financial records, bank transactions. None of it adds up. Mateo's been embezzling funds, redirecting money meant for the hotel into private accounts. Judy's been helping him cover his tracks." Marvin's brows knit together as he scanned the documents. His expression darkened with every scroll. "How long has this been happening?" Marvin asked, his voice low and controlled, but the anger beneath was unmistakable. "Months," Brian replied, the weight of his discovery evident in his tone. "Maybe longer. He's been slashing budgets, firing staff, and manipulating the board to keep them off his trail. Meanwhile, the hotel's falling apart, and he's pocketing the difference." Marvin continued to study the screen, his jaw tightening with each new piece of evidence. The gravity of what Brian had uncovered was clear, and the tension in the car was almost suffocating. Marvin's jaw tightened, his expression grim as he studied the evidence on Brian's phone. "I had my suspicions," he said, his voice low, "but I didn't realize it was this bad. Some of the staff mentioned concerns, but nothing like this." Brian nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. At last, Marvin understood the depth of Mateo's betrayal. "We need to act quickly," Brian urged, his tone urgent. "Mateo's already on edge. If he figures out we're onto him—" Marvin's gaze sharpened, cutting Brian off mid-sentence. "He won't," he said firmly. "I'll call for an emergency board meeting first thing tomorrow. We'll present this evidence, and Mateo won't have anywhere to hide." For the first time in weeks, Brian felt a flicker of hope. After enduring days of fear and tension, after watching Mateo dismantle everything his father had built at Henry Plaza, there was finally a path forward. They were on the verge of taking Mateo down. But the moment was fleeting. Brian's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back into the present. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he read the message from Grace. "Mateo's looking for you. Judy is convinced you're hiding something." Brian's blood turned cold. He knew exactly what this meant. Mateo and Judy were closing in, and his cover was hanging by a thread. "Marvin," Brian said quickly, his voice edged with urgency, "I have to go. If Mateo gets to me before the board has a chance to act—" Marvin's eyes narrowed, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Go," he said firmly. "I'll handle the rest. The board will see this evidence. Mateo's time is up." Brian nodded, slipping out of the car into the cool night air. As the vehicle pulled away, he began walking back toward Henry Plaza, his mind racing. Every step felt heavy with the weight of what was at stake. He knew he couldn't stay at the hotel much longer. Mateo and Judy were tightening their grip, and it was only a matter of time before they cornered him. But leaving wasn't an option either. He needed to stay close to ensure the board followed through on Marvin's promise to confront Mateo. The fate of Henry Plaza and the legacy his father had poured his life into now rested on the next 24 hours. The following morning, Brian Henry arrived at Henry Plaza with a heavy heart and a gnawing sense of unease. He knew the stakes had never been higher. Marvin had assured him that the evidence would be presented to the board that day, but until the confrontation took place, Brian remained vulnerable. Navigating the familiar staff corridors, Brian kept his movements deliberate and discreet. Every step felt like walking a tightrope, with the ever-present eyes of Judy and Mateo watching for even the slightest misstep. The tension in the air was thick, and each interaction with his colleagues carried an undercurrent of fear. By late morning, the unease among the staff was impossible to ignore. Muted whispers floated through the hallways as news circulated. Mateo had been summoned to a meeting with the board. Brian's heart quickened. This was the moment they had been working toward. Everything now hinged on Marvin's ability to convince the board to act decisively. Despite the glimmer of hope, Brian couldn't shake the dread that gnawed at him. Mateo wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and if he suspected Brian's involvement, things could escalate dangerously fast. He retreated to the break room to steady his nerves. Every passing minute felt agonizingly slow as he waited for word from Marvin. The silence pressed in around him, amplifying his racing thoughts. Brian paced the room, his mind running through every worst-case scenario. What if Mateo managed to talk his way out of it? What if the board wasn't convinced? Suddenly, the door flew open and Grace stumbled in, her face pale with panic. "Brian," she gasped, her voice trembling. "He knows. Mateo knows." The words hit Brian like a blow. His breath caught, and his pulse thundered in his ears. "Knows," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Grace nodded frantically, her fear evident in her wide eyes. "I overheard Judy talking to him. She's been suspicious of you for weeks. Ever since you were caught near his office, they've been watching you. Now they're certain you're the one who's been working against them." Brian felt a chill creep over him. The room seemed to shrink around him as the weight of Grace's words sank in. He had known this day would come, but he had underestimated how quickly things could unravel. "They're planning to act fast," Grace continued, her voice tight with urgency. "Mateo is furious. He thinks you're trying to take him down, and he's not going to stop until he shuts you down first." Brian took a steadying breath, his mind racing. The trap had been set, and now Mateo was hunting for him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew he couldn't back down. He had come too far to let fear derail everything. "Grace," Brian said, his voice firm despite the panic threatening to overtake him, "you need to stay out of this. If Mateo finds out you've been helping me." "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," Grace interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You can't do this on your own." Brian met her gaze, seeing the resolve behind her worry. He gave her a faint nod. "We don't have much time," he said, his mind already formulating a plan. "If Mateo knows, then we need to act before he does." Grace nodded, her expression determined. "What do we do?" Brian clenched his fists, a new wave of determination surging through him. "We finish this." Brian Henry clenched his fists, his thoughts spinning in every direction. He needed a plan, quickly. The air in the break room felt suffocating as panic clawed at the edges of his mind. He couldn't let Mateo win, but every instinct screamed at him to run. If Mateo confronted him now, it would be the end of everything he had worked for. There was no way to explain away what had been uncovered. "What do I do?" Brian asked, his voice taut with urgency, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Grace's eyes met his, a mixture of fear and determination burning in them. "You have to get out of here, right now," she said firmly. "If Mateo catches you here, he'll make sure you're not just fired, but that you're completely ruined. And we both know he's capable of worse." Brian's heart thundered in his chest. The idea of leaving the hotel felt like giving up, like abandoning the fight for everything his father had built. But staying meant walking straight into the lion's den. He couldn't fight Mateo's wrath head-on, not without jeopardizing the evidence already in the board's hands. "I can't just leave," Brian argued, his frustration spilling over. "I've come too far to let him destroy this. Marvin has the proof, and he's going to confront Mateo. I need to be here when it happens." Grace shook her head, desperation creeping into her voice. "Brian, you don't get it. Mateo doesn't care about the board or their decisions. His priority right now is silencing you. He'll erase any trace of that evidence before it ever sees the light of day." Brian exhaled slowly, the truth of her words hitting hard. Mateo had already shown how ruthless he could be. If he was coming for Brian, there was no telling how far he'd go to protect his crumbling empire. Still, Brian couldn't just walk away. "I need to buy some time," he said, his voice firmer now as the beginnings of an idea took shape. If I can stay hidden for a few hours, long enough for Marvin to confront him, I might still have a chance. Grace frowned, her worry etched deeply on her face. But where? Mateo and Judy have people watching everyone. They'll track you down. Brian's eyes darted around the room as his mind raced through the possibilities. The hotel was massive, a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, many of which Mateo rarely if ever visited. Suddenly, an idea clicked. The service areas, Brian said, his tone decisive. Mateo never goes back there. I can stay in one of the storage rooms until I get word from Marvin. Grace hesitated, clearly torn. Are you sure that's safe? If they catch you, it's the best chance I've got, Brian replied, his determination solidifying. Just a few hours, that's all I need. Marvin will take care of the rest. After a long pause, Grace nodded reluctantly. All right, I'll do what I can to cover for you. If anyone asks, I'll say you were reassigned to another shift. Brian's gratitude was evident as he gave her a small, tense smile. Thank you, Grace. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Grace returned the smile, though worry still shadowed her face. Just promise me you'll be careful. Mateo is dangerous, Brian. You can't take any chances. I promise, Brian said with quiet conviction. When this is over, Mateo will be the one who's gone. Not me. With that, Brian left the break room, his heart pounding with anticipation. The weight of everything rested on these next few hours. There was no room for mistakes. Not now. As soon as Grace left the break room, Brian Henry slipped out through the back, his movements careful yet brisk as he navigated the labyrinth of employee corridors. The muted hum of activity around him was a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing in his chest. A few staff members passed by, their faces drawn with the stress of the day. None of them paid him any mind. Everyone was too preoccupied with their own concerns, especially under the unrelenting gaze of Judy. Brian's pulse quickened as he approached the service elevators tucked away at the rear of the Henry Plaza Hotel. His finger hovered over the button before he pressed it, his eyes darting over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching. Every second felt like an eternity, the walls around him seeming to close in with every passing moment. Finally, the elevator doors opened with a soft ding. Brian stepped inside, quickly pressing the button for the basement. The service areas below were a warren of storage rooms, laundry facilities, and maintenance corridors, spaces rarely frequented by anyone beyond the hotel's unseen workers. It was the perfect place to lay low, somewhere Mateo and Judy would never think to search.